I'd like to cover a little bit of the interface for the materials palette, and that can be found in the materials section of Amorphium. Now, I'm going to just cover this briefly and just the way the interface works, because I will cover texturing your objects later on in this CD. But as you notice, you'll see that you have a bunch of these little square icons here, and what these represent is the actual texture that's being applied to your object within that section. So this little speckled icon represents paint on the surface, like if you were to paint on the surface of your object. That's what that is representative of. But if I were to change this to a color, you'll see that the color shows red there. It's a red color, and you see it up on the object. Now, this slider here is the value for how much of this texture you've got applied is actually showing on your object. So if I were to bring this texture down, you'll notice that the diffuse color is adding less and less of the red and going more to black, because I'm removing some of that color. And it's just the amount that that color shows. And that's the same for all the types. This is a value setting for the amount. Now, the little pull down menu here, you have many options for the type of texture you apply. The first 6 here are for color. There's some presets like green, red, and blue here, white and black, and then there's color, which actually it's kind of silly to have, because any of these you can just click and edit and modify them by just clicking. Any of the options you can modify by clicking on the little icon, and so I can just change this to whatever kind of color I want it to be by adjusting the color settings. So now I've got, I've adjusted the color that I want. So now you'll notice that other than color, you have a bunch of other options here. Now you can actually turn texture completely off if you want, and you can see that there is now no surface color. You have paint, which is what was on the object earlier, and any object you create in Amorphium will start out with paint as your diffuse color setting. Texture will let you actually load an image to place on the object, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'll load texture, open that, and you'll see that now I've got a texture map actually mapped on this object. And also you have procedurals. Now down here, these are all procedural maps, and what these do are, these are math algorithms, things like a fractal pattern. This is like math computer generated fractal, which can be scaled to whatever size you want it to be. But all these particular procedures, you don't need an image to apply them. They are all computer generated within Amorphium. Now, an interesting thing with modifying your textures, and you can layer your textures pretty much infinitely, and so let me show you kind of how that works. By clicking in the icon, you bring up the edit options for that particular texture. So I'm now editing the clouds procedural texture, and you can see I have white and black here for the 2 parts to the texture. Now I can change this to a different color, so I can actually change the way it looks. Now you'll notice that with this pop down that I've got the same ones that you had over here on this pull down. You have all the same options. So now if I wanted to add, say, a gradient to the white section, you can see now I've got a gradient going in there where the green used to be, going from kind of white to black. Now if I want to edit that, I can click the edit button, and that's the same as if I was clicking on the whole icon here. It'll bring up the options for that gradient. Now I can choose, instead of white, I can choose noise, and you can see now it's grading from noise to black, and I can choose edit again and edit the noise and change the, say, the color of one of them, and then change the other 2. Let's go with something really funky here. Let's change it to dots, and I'll edit the dots and adjust the scale of the dots. And so now I've been able to layer all these together to get the actual look that I want for my object. And you can infinitely just keep adding and adding and adding layers and layers and layers and layers. And of course, if you had 50 layers, it would take, of course, a little bit longer to render your object because it's having to blend all those layers together. But this allows you to have a lot of control over the actual surface of your object. And everything I did here was with procedures. I didn't even need an image map. It's all done internally, which allows you a lot of control to be able to create some kind of a surface texture for your object. I'm going to go ahead and change this back to just a plain color here so I can show you the rest of the options within the palette a little easier. So I just change it to a blue. Now that was just using diffuse color, which is the actual color on the surface of the object. Now you have a bunch of different types here. Specular color allows you to adjust the actual color and brightness of the little hotspot here, because specular means the highlight on your object. So if I were to turn this down, you can see that the highlight is going away. If I change the color, you can see now I changed the color red. It's got this kind of red hot spot on the blue, so it's kind of turning it to more of a magenta color, but it's affecting the actual hot spot on the surface of the object. Now, specular roughness is the width of your highlight. So if you turn it up, you can see the highlight gets really wide, or you can turn it down and make it really shiny, polished looking object. And so specular roughness adjusts the width of your highlight. Ambient color is the brightness of your object. So the higher your ambient color value, the less lights and shadows will affect it, the more the object will be self-luminous. So this allows you to adjust kind of, if you wanted an object to not have as harsh of a shadow, or you want the object to be where you want to be able to see parts of it in the shadow, you can turn up your ambient color. And you can actually give this a color value if you want. So if I give this like a green, you'll see that it's now changing the shadow areas to kind of a green. So I'll go ahead and put that back to and transparency is basically what it's saying is it'll make the object more transparent as you make it a higher value. You won't see it represented here in your display, partly to the fact that it's harder for interactivity and redraw to be able to see an object that is transparent within your view. It would slow the computer down too much, and so I think that's the reason they chose not to show that in your view. To see this, you would have to render your object out. So, but this, if I make this 50%, that means you're going to be able to see through the object. It'll be 50% transparent. So now, along with transparency, you have refraction. Now, refraction will only work if you have some kind of transparency value to your object. And what refraction does is allows you to adjust how much the light bends as it passes through your object. So, for example, when you look at a glass of water, it magnifies everything you look through. When you look through water, you're seeing a magnified image from whatever water is in front of. And that's because light hits water, bends, and actually creates a distorted image. To your eye is seeing a distorted image through water or through glass or through a lens or that sort of thing. Anything transparent that has refraction is going to bend light. Well, the value here is based on the index of refraction. So 1 would be air, where to our eyes no difference in light bending. If you were to adjust this higher, you can get like water and glass looks to your objects where it will magnify any objects that are behind it. Now you can find references to index of refraction through science reference books and that sort of thing. This is based on an index of refraction value. I find for most things between 1.5 and 1 tend to be best for most things, whether you're making objects that look like glass and whatnot. And you can play with this until you get kind of the look that you want. And of course you won't see it until you render your actual object, and you have to have some type of transparency to your object before you would see it. But that's basically what refraction setting does. Now, reflectivity will adjust the amount of how much your object reflects the environment. So if you stick this object next to another object, it will reflect the other object within it. And you can see a representation of a reflection on this object. Now this is just a internal reflection map that it's putting on there to give you an idea of how reflective your object is. This image won't actually be on your object when you render, and actually there isn't really reflection mapping like mapping a fake environment map on your object to give it the illusion of reflecting a world. There isn't really a map setting for that, but there is a trick to be able to fake that, and I will show you that later on in the texture section of the CD. But this would at least give you a visual representation of how much reflectivity your object has. And the last texture mapping setting here in materials is your bump map. And now bump maps you won't be able to see in your view here either, and that's because of hardware redraw. But what bump map does is allows you to put bumps on the surface of your object. Now it won't actually deform the object like height shop does. It won't actually change the geometry at all. It'll paint on the surface based on where the light is placed in your scene. It'll paint the illusion of bumps on the surface of your object, and this is to save render time if you have a low polygon object and you don't want to actually detail all the bumps. You can actually put a texture map on there to do bumps as opposed to actually modeling the object. So I'm going to go ahead and render this out real quick, and I'm going to turn off transparency and turn some of this down so you can really see what the bump map is going to do. I'll go ahead and turn it up, and I'll go ahead and do a render real quick so you can see what bump mapping does, since you couldn't see it in the view there. This way you'll get an idea. So you can see here how it's created bumps on the surface of the object based on that noise pattern within the materials. And if you look at the edge here, the edge is really perfectly round. If it was a really bumpy object like this, you'd see the bumps on the side. Well, that's because it's just painting the object to look like there's bumps based on where the light source is placed, so that you can give the illusion of it and save yourself tons of time in renders without having to actually model that in your object. So that's how bump mapping works. Now you'll notice too that this is a grayscale image, and that the bumps were, raised and lowered based on a grayscale image, and that's because it's saying it's taking the grayscale values and saying that anywhere that there was white, to make that raised portions of the bumps, and anywhere there was black to make that lowered, and anything in between black and white is a variant of height of your bumps. And this concept is used throughout all your texture types. If I were to put a grayscale image in your transparency here, the whiter areas will be more transparent and the black areas will be less transparent. So you can actually have like a dirty glass, a glass that's more transparent in areas, like it's got finger smudges and that sort of thing on it. So it's not so transparent in those areas, but then in the areas that are kind of polished, it's more transparent. So you can actually, dirty up your objects by using this type of thing. Same thing with specular roughness. If I were to go into specular roughness here and change this to a noise, you can see where it's breaking up the actual specular highlight. So you're actually getting the areas that are white are saying, oh, well, where it's white, make that a wider radius to the specular highlight, and wherever the areas are black, make it a less of a radius. So it's giving you this nice broken hotspot on your object. And that works for everything. Reflectivity, it bases itself on a brightness value of your texture. So if I were to add noise here to reflectivity, you can see where the white areas are, it's more reflective, and black areas are less reflective. Now if I were to change this to a color, if I were to edit this and say make the white, instead of white, make it red, you can see that it's going to be a red reflective. It's going to actually reflect everything, but it's going to reflect it with red. Now bump maps, refraction, and specular roughness don't take advantage of color. They just use a grayscale to base their texture off of, whereas the others you can actually use color in to get different effects as well. So keep that in mind. If you put color in your bump, it's not going to it's not going to use it. It's just going to use the brightness value of the color to base its height of the bump. And it's the same thing with specular roughness and refraction. Now, you'll notice too that you have a load and a save button here on the bottom of this material window. Now, if I wanted to save this texture, if I really liked the way I have this texture on my object, I can actually hit save. I'll just call this my texture. Save. Okay. So now if I had another object here, and I'll go ahead and create a little box here. And I'll come back into materials. And I'll choose my box. Now if I load, go in here to load, I'll find my texture here. Now you'll notice that when I loaded that, it actually put that texture on that object. So if I look at these two, I have the same texture now on both objects. Now this is really handy for, say you've made a really nice wood texture with an image map and some, procedures to do dirtying it up and make some really nice wood texture. You can actually save that and use it later and load it on other objects and that sort of thing. So that's really handy for creating your own libraries, say, of your textures that you use on your objects, so that you don't ever have to try to hunt them down by finding the object you did it on or remember what parameters you did. You can just save it. It's very handy. And the last thing I'd like to show you too is that, as you noticed before with bump and transparency and refraction and whatnot, you can't see the actual difference on the surface of the object. If I were to change this here, you don't see it happening here. That's because you have to render a bump to see it. Well, if you just want to see the way it is lined up on your object based on the grayscale, you have this nice option down here on display to change what particular material you're working with at any given time. Right now it's set to material preview, which previews the whole material as a whole on the object, and that's why you're seeing everything from diffuse color to specular color, all that at once. That it can show you, it's showing you everything it can at once. Now if I wanted to just look at the bump map, I can choose that, and now I'm looking at just the bump map on the surface of the object and go, okay, I just want to work with the bump map now and make sure I'm getting it kind of the way I want the bump to look. That way you're able to adjust it based on you're actually looking at your object instead of just having to go by this little icon down here. That way, at least if you're not seeing the bumps, the physical bumps themselves, you're able to see how the texture lies on there, so you can know how the bumps are going to come out a little bit better. And it's the same thing for everything. Like if I wanted to look at just the reflectivity, it's showing me now just the color portion of the reflectivity of exactly the way it lays on the surface. Now if I go back to material preview, that'll show me the materials. Paint will show me the paint on the surface. Since this is just a blue cube, I don't have any paint on it, it's just showing blue. You can do white, you can show me your masks on the object, and you can also show depth, which actually shows from the camera view, it shows like what's closest to the camera, and right now this point is, the closer the camera it is, the more white it is. If I rotate this, you can actually see the depth change. And that can be good for just finding out exactly if areas of your object are the same height. Like say you had the eyebrows of your character really sticking out forward and you want to make sure that they're pretty close, you can use this to look straight on the object and see if they're the same brightness value. And I'll show you what depth is really good for later on in the texture section. And that's basically how the interface works within the materials palette.